Thank you very much, Professor Kai, for that kind introduction, and thank you, University President Professor Lee, for your kind introduction also, and for this opportunity to visit Cheongda, which, as I was saying, we were just speaking earlier, and such a beautiful university, a beautiful campus, and I think many things for my university back in Ireland to learn from the way that this university is run, but also in general, a lot of good examples. We were talking about the wonderful student accommodation that I witnessed up on the hills, and your use of this area here, this amazing library. It's quite inspiring to visit this university, a university, of course, with such a prestigious and famous history. So it really is an honor to be invited here. And when Professor Watanabe Hiroshi Dubian Hao Xianxian, when he told me, asked me if this might be something, I was very excited, and it's wonderful to finally be able to be here today. So thank you very much, and also Professor Lina, of course, for facilitating everything, and Selina, wherever she is, also for helping so much. Okay, so let me just get myself a bit organized here. The last 2 days, I've been talking directly about the interaction between historical method and Confucianism. And I've been using the Cambridge history of Confucianism as a textual example for that. Today's talk shifts topic from Confucianism to democracy, while still looking at the interaction between global historical methodology and intellectual history. We move our focus from a tradition, Confucianism, to one particular concept, democracy. Today's talk also shifts the focus of written work from the Cambridge history of Confucianism, which I edit, to the Cambridge history of democracy, which happily I do not edit, but I'm just writing one of the chapters. And so I guess I'm sort of presenting the chapter for the Cambridge history of democracy here today, with a few things added in to directly interact with the theme of this series of talks. So in this sense, we have 2 points of continuity between the last 2 days and today. One is our interest in historical method, and the other is actually 3 points of continuity. Our interest in historical method, the very particular vehicle of this Cambridge history series as a genre, and then thirdly is the role of Confucianism, because as we'll see, Confucianism will return into our discussion of democracy in Japan. So to begin with, though, I'd like to focus or return to a topic we discussed 2 days ago, which is the Cambridge history series as a genre, and in particular its relationship with periodization and so-called universal history. As mentioned on Tuesday, one common attribute of most Cambridge histories, and certainly both the Cambridge history of Confucianism and the Cambridge history of democracy, is a longue durée approach. They cover thousands of years of history. And as we mentioned, as well as the longue durée approach being part of the Cambridge history genre since the turn of the 19th and into the early 20th century, longue durée is also advocated today. People today are really emphasizing long duration history and its importance. And the most famous example is this very recent book, History Manifesto, by Joe Gouldy and David Armitage, where they advocate longue durée history as a way of making the discipline of history socially relevant and ending what they see as an increasingly very harmful trend towards short-termism in our global society. And particularly, they see that short-termism as related to social science approaches and consider history needs to be more longue durée to deal with that. And we talked about that at length 2 days ago, so I won't carry on anymore there. Now, if one's writing a history of Confucianism, it's clear that it should be longue durée. Nobody would think of a longue durée approach to Confucianism as strange or in any way abnormal. But what does it mean to take a longue durée approach to the history of democracy? For democracy, taking a longue durée approach could be controversial, as it would seem to suggest that democracy is or has been something more than or something different to what it is today, what it is right now. And that's controversial. And that's controversial because, of course, democracy is the way that coercive, vertical, top-down governance is justified in societies that call themselves democratic. The power of the police, the power of the army, including invading other countries. This is justified through the concept of democracy. So to question the concept of democracy questions the legitimacy of the American invasion of Iraq, or anything else for that matter, or even just normal day-to-day government activities. Now, the most popular and simplistic way to define democracy today is based on simply describing the system that exists in many Western countries and many non-Western countries, holding elections for national government through popular suffrage. So this is a very descriptive, very presentist, and perhaps we could say rather simplistic definition. It's also notable that it's not very historical. It lacks usefulness in history. From an historical perspective, it is striking that barely any of the countries which are democratic today had universal suffrage even in the 1940s or 50s. Right? The right for women to vote was, other than in one or two countries like Australia and New Zealand, was only introduced in the mid and sometimes the late 20th century. So men's right to vote was also heavily restricted by property requirements in many countries well into the 20th century. So universal suffrage, elections as a way of defining democracy, is so recent it almost has no history. By including chapters on the pre-20th century world, the Cambridge History of Democracy series presumes a definition of democracy that means something more than the selection of governments through multi-party elections. We are encouraged to consider deeper, perhaps less mechanical conceptions of democracy. Now, even definitions of democracy that are based in electoral politics, however, usually base the definition of democracy in something more concrete than just elections. Even the most famous intellectual advocates of the party electoral democratic system accept that that system is not government by the people. And the most famous example is, of course, Joseph Schumpeter, who was good enough to clearly state an assumption long present in liberal political thought, that the nature of modern governance was simply too complex to be grasped by the people. His advocacy, his strong advocacy of the electoral system and of party electoral selection, was instead an instrumentalist justification based in the idea that the competition inherent in electoral contests would function as an instrument of selection among the ruling group. The electoral system of selection was not an ethical or even political end in itself. Rather, it was simply a mechanism to create competition within the governing elite. This was designed to make the governing elite function efficiently, in much the same way advocates of the liberal market saw competition functioning in the marketplace as an efficient means of resource allocation in the realm of economics. Democracy is an efficient way of allocating the elite members into the positions, as it were. Schumpeter's view on this point was influenced by aspects in the writing of John Stuart Mill, and also underlay the quote that you see here from Schumpeter's ideas were influenced by ideas from John Stuart Mill, which also influenced this quote you see from East Asia's most famous early liberal thinker, the Japanese educator Fukuzawa Yukichi. Even the greatest liberal political thinkers thus did not see electoral democracy as an end in itself, but merely as a means to a greater ends. For Mill, a very Protestant and thus ultimately Christian concept of freedom. For Schumpeter, efficiency. and for Fukuzawa, civilization. So those are just the liberals, and of course if we looked at socialist thought and much Republican thought, of course, democracy also has a whole bunch of other meanings and aims, which I won't go into right now as they're not related to this particular talk. The main point I wish to make here is simply that the act of framing democracy in longue durée terms, as the Cambridge history does, clearly implies that democracy is something more than just the selection of government through universal suffrage elections. The Cambridge History of Democracy's first volume begins with ancient history and ends in 1350. The second volume covers 1200 to 1800, and only the third volume engages the 19th century to now. The project thus is clearly conceived in terms of an approach to democracy taken in much recent scholarship that you can find in, for instance, journals like Democratic Theory, for instance, is one a politics journal where you see a lot of these ideas, and a range of mainstream articles in big journals like Political Theory that call for a more global history of democracy, opening out to more diversity of thought. Such perspectives from political theory and political science argue that it is not reasonable to presume that democratic ideas only emerged from one minority population in the world. It's not reasonable to think that democratic thinking only comes from, I don't know, Europe, and that others had no democratic inclinations, nor is it reasonable to accept that all over the world, democracy will always take the same forms. A longue durée approach emancipates us to think about issues in democracy such as the rule of the people or rule for the people, and what these things might mean across different times and cultures. I might just move this over here. In terms of global historical methodology, it means we might think about different kinds of democracy, the disengagement of democracy from one particular homogeneous culture or civilizational paradigm, the West, obviously. C, democracy not as teleological progress, democracy not as something always moving forward, inevitable and inevitably increasing, but maybe also histories which include democratic decline, ups and downs. Democracy can become no longer tied to a single vision, the West and the teleology of modernity. A longue durée approach, in other words, potentially frees democracy from that role in contemporary ideology that I spoke about before. An example of a theorist who takes this approach is Samuel Moyn, for instance, who, just for one example, who links democracy to the self-making of society, meaning people's realization that society, if formed by them, not by God or a theocracy or an aristocracy. For others, it means participation, ideas of participatory democracy, for instance. And in both these terms, of course, democracy is much more than elections. Confucianism, in certain manifestations, would appear to have the possibility of being democratic. We'll talk more about that tomorrow, in the workshop thing tomorrow. The task I've been given is to write a chapter in the Cambridge History of Democracy covering democracy in Japan between 1200 and 1800. Now, obviously, that has nothing to do with elections, but it would certainly be something to do with rule for the people and maybe even rule by the people. Now, for most of this period, from 1200 to 1800, Confucianism was not actually a defining part of Japanese politics. What clearly was a defining feature of Japanese governance between 1200 and 1800 was rule by a warrior caste called samurai, or warrior rule, often through a system of government called shogunates, and you can see a list of the 3 shogunates here. So as you would know, towards the end of shogunate rule in Japan, in the later Tokugawa shogunate, especially from about 1700 onwards, Confucianism did come to play a major role. And this was despite the fact that Confucianism and samurai shogunate rule appear theoretically to be almost the opposites of each other, which is a point I'll come back to in a minute. So rule by a military caste would not seem to offer much scope for discussion about democracy, but I think in a minute I'll talk about how that works. So what I'd like to do now is sort of enter the chapter, look at how my chapter explores these issues. So in this talk I'd like to introduce the chapter and then move on to the discussion thereafter. From the beginnings of modern Japan, Japanese democracy has been understood as an outcome of Japan's own past and imagined through contrast with the pasts of other countries. So I'm talking since the late 19th century, the early 20th century, when Japan embraced democratic representative government, which of course Japan still has now. From the beginning of that period, Japanese understood Japanese democracy as arising through Japan's own past in contrast with the past of other countries, the Western nations, and China. Modern national identity, imagined together with the manufacture of a longue durée pre-modern history, has thereby influenced how democracy in Japan has been perceived and explained. Perhaps more interestingly, democracy has conversely become a lens through which past history and present identity are in turn imagined. The histories of some of the most enduring global political structures in all of history, Japan's shogunates, and also the Chinese imperial system, as well as European monarchies, have as a result been rewritten in the modern period as part of the construction of cultural ideologies of democracy, deeply influencing both narratives of national history and theoretical imaginations of democracy. Between the 13th and 19th centuries, Japan was ruled through a system of government unique enough to warrant its own word in the English language, shogunate. Conveniently for this chapter, the beginning and end of shogunate rule in Japan in 1185 and 1867 respectively correspond closely enough to the periodization of the volume 1200 to 1800. So they gave me a job, 1200 to 1800. Luckily, Japanese history fits perfectly in that scope. So as a samurai-led and administered military government, a shogunate would not seem, at first glance, to accord well with modern ideas of democracy. Yet intriguingly, many influential modern political theorists since the late 19th century have used the history of shogunates to explain Japanese democracy. In fact, for most of Japanese modernity, the pre-modern history of shogunate rule in the country has been portrayed as a key determining factor leading to the broad acceptance of liberal democratic thinking in Japan. This chapter will begin with a brief examination of this modern narrative and its own historical background in modern Japanese nationalism. The rise of modern Japanese nationalism was influenced both by the rise of modern Western imperialism and also by the corresponding decline of imperial China. This background informed an historical move through which Japanese shogunates became counterintuitively employed to contrast Japan with imperial China and thereby explain the nature of liberty, free thinking and democracy in Japanese culture. So in the first part of this chapter, it focuses on the historiography that links pre-modern Japan to democracy, briefly unpacking the thinking through which the modern success of Japanese democracy became linked, strangely, to Japanese pre-modern history of militarism. So that's section number one here, number one, the first part of the talk. We then move on to number two, the second part of the talk, where we look at the actual history of Japan between 1200 and 1800, focusing on what have long been demarcated as Japan's medieval and early modern periods. Here we will confirm the military basis of governance between 1200 and 1800, but also look at the significant rise in the role of public sentiment and political action within that system, as well as attempts during this period to decouple Japanese governance from militarism. This historical inquiry of the medieval and early modern periods, while on the one hand confirming the rise of democratic thinking within shogunal rule, will also complicate narratives of how those trends arose and what their relationship was to rising nationalism and indeed approaches to the military and violence. And it will also trace a changing interaction with Confucianism. The conclusion will then employ this historical analysis in a return to our consideration of current conceptions of democracy. So in the end, we'll come back to democracy, both in East Asia and globally. So let's move on to section one, modern images of liberty, democracy, and shogunate rule. A positive narrative of the history of shogunal rule's effect on modern Japanese capacities for liberty, and pluralism was initially and most influentially presented in the 1870s by Fukuzawa Yukichi. Fukuzawa positioned his historical perspective on shogunal rule in Japan in line with a European-influenced view of Chinese despotism. This occurred as part of his larger and more famous attempt to disengage Japanese politics, society and culture and imaginations of its past from its history of Sinitic influence. And this is the famous Datsuwa New Oron, right? Leaving Asia, entering Europe thesis that Fukuzawa had. Here he argues, for instance, one should know that the ethos of freedom can only come into existence through competitive discussion between a plurality of positions. The Chinese imperial system was despotic governance. The symbolism of the sacred and the power of strength combined as one to control the people. And since the teachings of Confucius and Mencius were most convenient for the maintenance of this system, only they were propagated throughout the country. End quote above, where Fukuzawa labels the Chinese imperial system despotic, is part of a longer passage from Fukuzawa's most influential text, An Outline of a Theory of Civilization, where he narrates contrasting longue durée intellectual histories of China and Japan, constructing different culturally specific national characters, which he holds determine their various levels of openness to progress. According to Fukuzawa's narrative, in both ancient Japan and ancient China, a hard difference between the governors and the governed was established and sacralized. Mediated through Confucian ritual, this made both ancient China and ancient Japan dictatorships. For Fukuzawa then, the 2,000 years of imperial rule in China between the 2nd century BC and the dawn of the 20th century was Asian despotism. For China, this conflation of ideas of sacredness and strength continued on right up until the modern era, 2 millennia of Chinese/Asian despotism. Now, in Fukuzawa's vision of Japanese history, by contrast, the medieval period in Japan, the rise of warrior household governments, the rise of shogunates, from the 12th century, separated sacred and brute power in Japan. Quote, but in the medieval age of the warrior, this is Fukuzawa, but in the medieval age of the warrior houses, the social system broke down and political power came to lay in the hands of the military households, the samurai. The two concepts of sacred rank and strength of power were so obviously distinct that people could hold in their heads the simultaneous existence and functioning of two ideas. Once they did so, they could not help adding a third, the principle of reason. With the principle of reason added to the idea of reverence for the imperial dignity and the idea of military rule, none of these three concepts was able to dominate. And since no single concept dominated, there naturally flowed the spirit of freedom. This obviously was not the same for China. End quote. For Fukuzawa, samurai shogunate governance reliance on violence, thus ironically, represented the birth of the ethos of freedom in Japan. Because in Japan, samurai governance continued into the 19th century, contemporary Japanese had, according to Fukuzawa, thereby inherited the potentiality of this ethos of freedom, whereas the Chinese had already, nearly 2,000 years earlier, had this potential shut down. In this manner, Fukuzawa culturalized the idea of freedom, linking it to a particularly militarist formulation of Japanese national identity. This formulation mirrored contemporaneous Northwestern European, particularly British tropes that linked ideas of intellectual autonomy to cultural historical imaginations of martial culture, martial military culture. His contrastive histories of China and Japan allowed Fukuzawa to condemn China in totality in much the same way as his Protestant triumphalist role models in Europe condemned the Catholic, the Jew, and the Muslim, and in a similar context of imperial competition and colonial expansion. It's also important to note, however, that Fukuzawa was here talking about freedom. For him, the key element in his most important conceptualization. Democracy for Fukuzawa was not in itself an ideal. In Bunmei-ryon no Gairyaku, in the work on civilization, he followed and developed the critique of popular democracy of the late John Stuart Mill, not seeing democracy in itself as a positive. For Fukuzawa, politics was only one of several instrumental branches of human conduct which could be bent towards civilization. As he put it, if civilization is the deer, then politics is merely the hunting party. For Fukuzawa, not only democracy, but politics in general was not an end in itself. It was rather only a method for the delivery of the ultimate outcome, civilized society. And this approach is, of course, similar to Schumpeter's, as I pointed out, which values democracy not as an end in itself, but as a method leading to a desired outcome. Fukuzawa's anchoring of Japanese liberalism in this historical narrative was significant not only in itself, but also because it critically influenced how Japanese liberal democracy was understood thereafter, coming to underpin later ideas of Japanese democracy by a wide range of influential thinkers and politicians, notably including advocates of popular democracy. And one example is this one, Tsuda Sokichi, who used a similar analysis of the difference between Chinese and Japanese culture and politics in their pre-modern history to argue for a more populist form of democratic nationalism, a horizontal ethno-nationalist democracy centred on the emperor. And I'll quote from Tsuda, quote, "In its totality, samurai ethics was something that, in psychological terms, emerged within samurai bands, cultivated through the mutual experience of struggle. In social terms, the basis was succession of the leader-follower, and that is the core reason why it differs from the sovereign-vassal-based relationship ethics of the Chinese people." Tsuda thus saw the social relations that existed in martial Japanese society as emerging not top-down through aristocratic doctrine, as he portrayed Chinese Confucianism, but bottom-up through social solidarity in real-life struggle, to use his words, by ordinary Japanese. Here we see Tsuda not only parallels Fukuzawa in the hard contrast of Confucian China and warrior Japan, but also emphasizes the horizontal group-oriented solidarity elements in samurai culture as he imagines it, then extending this vision of samurai culture to the general Japanese population, turning it into a sort of minzu, a sort of ethno idea. Quote, under samurai governance, and this is the quote on the left here, under samurai governance, the feudal system expanded and the common people became wrapped up together with the samurai in this kind of bottom-up organisation, leading to samurai-style ethics also being adopted by the common people. Nothing like this was seen in Chinese society, where the feudal system had not arisen, where the Chinese people daily lived in a Confucian ethics which viewed the common folk as beasts. In his use of the word feudal here, just after that, just to the left of the highlighted section, in his use of the word feudal here in a positive sense, Tsuda is both following Fukuzawa's approach of a generation earlier while also taking a swipe against the Marxist historians who had become so influential by Tsuda Sokichi's own time. So he's deliberately using feudalism positively, as a sort of to make a point. For our purposes, however, key here is that Tsuda's imagination of a horizontal ethno-national body, actually much more democratic than Fukuzawa's idea, is still constructed through an idealization of samurai culture and its popular dissemination under shogunal rule. It is also noteworthy that Tsuda openly labels this system as feudal, an association which parallels links between hereditary militarist society and liberty made in some English political thought. In summation, freedom and democracy in modern Japan, at least from the late 19th to mid-20th centuries, were imagined by major modern Japanese intellectuals in contrast to a despotic Chinese past. Arrayed against the so-called Chinese elements, which undoubtedly influenced Japanese history, are proposed so-called unique political structures and practices from Japanese so-called real-life experience, which provide the liberal democratic and popular democratic way out. This imagination of the democratic was thus also a form of exclusive nationalism, establishing a particular narrative of the emergence of national consciousness contrasted against the adjacent empire. And this kind of valorization of a supposedly local vernacular culture against the empire is something that didn't just happen in Japan. So if you think of parts of the Austro-Hungarian Empire and the Ottoman empires, a similar thing was happening at that time. Importantly, however, in this construction, neither Fukuzawa nor Tsuda attribute democratic thinking to Western culture or European culture, but to Japan's own culture. So despite the parallels seen with British models, it was not portrayed as British or Western. It rather came from Japan's own pre-modern culture. So it's therefore quite significant argument, given that even today many Western scholars continue to see democracy as no more than a Western export. Fukuzawa did not see things like that. So while anti-Asian and pro-European in some respects, he also laid the groundwork for alternative theories of modernity, including alternative paths to political liberalism. What's noteworthy in this case is firstly that the historical narrative was seen as totally independent of European models, thereby implying that ideas of freedom were humanist rather than culturalist, even though he then culturalizes them. And secondly, that the reconstructed local culture imagined in Japan, based as it was in samurai culture and the institution of the shogunate, linked modern identities of freedom and democracy with a pre-modern order overtly identified as militarist. So, what is the reality? Let's move on to the second main part of the chapter and the talk, which is the reality of shogunal politics and the people between 1200 and 1800. Between 1185 and 1867, Japan was indeed ruled by samurai, predominantly, in a uniquely indigenous system of government, shogunates. Shogunates were formerly decentralized systems of government headed by an overlord called the shogun, sitting at the head of a hereditary military hierarchy comprised of other regional lords and high-status samurai retainers. So this is the top percent of the samurai caste. So within the samurai caste, most samurai had virtually no power. There was a sort of nobility within the samurai caste. Rule by shogunates during the long period covered by this volume, however, was of course not monolithic. Firstly, it should be pointed out that in the period between the 13th and 16th centuries, warrior rule was challenged by non-samurai, fostering alternative forms of governance which existed in competition against shogunates. These non-shogunal forms of government sometimes lasted for as long as a century in certain large regions of Japan. Secondly, and arguably more significantly to the question of democracy, from the 17th century onwards, after the reunification of Japan under the Tokugawa shogunate, the military nature, under the Tokugawa shogunate, the military nature of shogunate rule came to be challenged from within, often by samurai themselves. So below, what we'll do now is we'll firstly examine military rule and the challenges that arose to it between 1200 and 1600, the medieval period, before moving on to concentrate on the period from 1600 onwards. So, 1200 to 1600, medieval shogunal governance and its competitors. Shogunal rule first emerged at the end of the 12th century when warrior caste samurai clan leaders appropriated the state leadership of Japan from the imperial aristocracy. For several hundred years up until the 11th century, the central part of what is now Japan had been ruled by a Japanese emperor and aristocracy through the utilization of governance technologies, notably legal and bureaucratic structures based on the Chinese Sui and Tang dynasties. We talked about that yesterday. The Ritsuryo system, it's called in Japanese. We talked about it quite a lot yesterday. By the 10th century, competition among different imperial aristocratic clans had come to undermine this state system, with political conflict increasingly being resolved not through the system, but through war, with aristocrats on various sides employing warrior caste clan armies against each other. In 1186, the warrior families took power for themselves. So after fighting on both sides of these wars for the imperial aristocrats, they thought, well, why don't we just rule ourselves? Establishing a new system of rule with a more organised, feudal-like basis, with each province being allocated to a local warrior caste strongman, usually someone related to the shogun. The top layers of governance were now bound to each other through loyal oath and family ties. This system proved significantly more stable than the previous system, with the Kamakura shogunate able to raise significantly more tax revenue and military force. Enough military force indeed for the two famous defeats of the Yuan-Mongol attacks on Japan during this period. The first challenge to shogunal rule occurred during the 14th century, with attempts to return rule to the imperial court. Temporarily successful during the short-lived rule of Emperor Go-Daigo in the so-called Kenmu Restoration of 1333 to 1336, shogunal rule was soon reasserted through the formation of a new shogunate, the Ashikaga shogunate, also called the Muromachi shogunate, in 1336. This led to the so-called Nambokucho, Northern and Southern Courts period, for the rest of the 14th century basically, where samurai groupings aligned either with this Ashikaga shogunate or its rival, the remnant imperial Southern Court. Some samurai bands and religious orders also decided to remain unaligned, and many regularly switched sides. This created a sustained period of continuing multipolar competition for power, often compared to the medieval period of Europe. These challenges to the rule of the Ashikaga shogunate from 1336 onwards, however, did not really constitute a challenge to samurai rule per se, because although some branches of the imperial house were politically active during the period, the imperial aristocracy always relied militarily and economically on the same samurai warrior households who held sway in the shogunates. So these Nambokucho conflicts were, in real political terms, really conflicts between different samurai groups, with warrior caste leaders continuing to dominate both sides. The second and most serious challenge to shogunal rule, and the only sustained challenge to warrior caste rule coming from outside the warrior caste, from non-samurai, came at the end of the 15th and through much of the 16th century, when large swathes of Japan came under the control of well-organised, Buddhist-inspired peasant states, the so-called Ikko-Ikki. These states, organised around agrarian village confederations, often rejected the samurai status system and its assumptions of hereditary feudal-style lordly rule. For nearly a century, the Ikko-Ikki constituted a viable alternative to the shogunal model of governance, dominating significant swathes of Japan by repeatedly defeating warrior caste feudal armies. These states and their religious supporters, however, were finally and comprehensively militarily defeated by samurai warlords towards the end of the 16th century, in the 1580s basically. This led to the re-establishment of shogunal government in a much stronger and increasingly centralised form, firstly under the warlords Oda Nobunaga and Toyotomi Hideyoshi, and then through the long-lived Tokugawa shogunate, which maintained a united Japanese shogunal government from 1603 until 1867. So that brings us to the next part of the talk, directly on the early modern period. The Tokugawa shogunate has thereby come to represent the zenith of shogunal political power and development. In addition to maintaining a monopoly of violence throughout the archipelago for nearly 250 years, The Tokugawa shogunate also presided over Japan's early modern development, including rapid increases in levels of literacy, urbanization, and financialization of the economy that by the early 1700s had made Japanese cities some of the most populated, literate, and wealthy in the world. Edo was the biggest city in the world in 1700 according to most measurements. The significant early modern development, facilitated by what people called the Pax Tokugawa, right, the Tokugawa peace, ushered in a commercial economy, surplus labour time, literacy, and national networks of communication, trade, and finance, which then began to transform both the samurai caste as a status group and their interaction with the society they titularly governed. The stability of Tokugawa rule is often linked with images of samurai martial power and domination. The beginning of Tokugawa rule in 1603 and the first couple of decades thereafter were indeed facilitated by massive military mobilization, following as they did directly upon Japan's 1590s invasion of Korea and massive war with Ming China. Back in Japan, it meant that the near total war mobilization, which had characterized Japan's 16th century civil war period, continued right up until the end of the 16th century. From the early 1600s onwards, however, there were basically no significant armed conflicts, either external or internal. By 1700, the rapid early modern development facilitated by the Pax Tokugawa had created a society in which governance had a much greater need for economic knowledge than military force. And this saw shogunal governance transition from what the Japanese historian Fujii Georgi, channeling Weber, calls the charismatic power of the early militarist period into the bureaucratic power of the later shogunal state. Now, the modern theories we encountered earlier, for instance Fukuzawa Yukichi's, linking Japanese liberal democracy with shogunal rule, they completely ignore these early modern developments. They don't take any notice of them. For them, Tokugawa period is feudal, that's it, right? No historians of Tokugawa Japan today would accept such a characterization. Rather, they focus on the early modernity of the period. I will argue below that those early modern changes are vital for considering the interaction between democracy and military rule in Japan, and indeed perhaps helpful for thinking about the nature of democracy more broadly. Early modern society under the Tokugawa shogunate actually originated a number of important alternatives to military rule, both in terms of the lives of the samurai and non-samurai Japanese during the period, but also in terms of the practice of governance and politics. These alternatives were often related to the development of more democratic ways of thinking and acting in politics, and indeed these more democratic alternatives often emerged through tension with the military system. Below, I will focus on three interlinked changes relevant to democracy that occurred as part of the early modern development of Japan. One ethnographical, another intellectual, and the third sociological and political. So these three factors I see as linked. The sociological changes leading to salon society, the intellectual rise of Confucian ideas of welfare and political economy, facilitating the centrality of popular protest and critique in the mid-Tokugawa period. Yeah, so this famous sort of Confucian term here is often, in its Tokugawa Japanese context, is most often translated into English as political economy, but we'll come back to that in a second. So let's move firstly to number one, the social context, the change in social context. Relatively early in the Tokugawa shogunate, major intellectuals, themselves samurai, began challenging the primarily military identity of the samurai caste. Yamaga-Soko, a Confucian-educated samurai thinker in the mid-1600s, is credited with the first use of the term way of the samurai in a manuscript he wrote in the 1620s or early 1630s. The very title of this document in Chinese and Japanese, which is at the extreme right there, Shridao or Shido, this title chooses a character. That first character is used in, can also be read in Japanese samurai. So this is one of three Chinese character options you have for creating the word samurai in Japanese. But of course, this, although it can be used to render the word samurai, it's primarily used in Sino-Japanese to indicate the social status associated with the gentleman. So even in its title thereby, this writing began to push the samurai towards continental imaginations of the gentry. The main innovation in Soko's argument was that samurai needed not only to be proficient in the military arts, but also in the literary arts. Reflecting the new reality of life for most samurai in Japan at the time of writing, Yamaga discerned that the main roles of a samurai in the pacified Japan ruled by the Tokugawa shogunate were not military, but administrative and educational. While arguing for retention of the capacity for military action, Yamaga depicted this dormant capacity as only one half of the samurai's duty, the other half being his active role in edifying the people. Yamaga's new way of the samurai, although a novel early modern Japanese invention, was clearly influenced by Chinese post-Sung dynasty conceptions of the gentry. This was most visible in the clear Confucian ethical positioning of Yamaga's text, which reversed former patterns of samurai writing which depicted the peasants as the chattel of the samurai caste. Instead, so no longer seeing peasants as owned by the samurai, but instead arguing that the samurai caste's entire existence could only be justified through service to the people. The argument leading to that outlook began with an analysis of the role of the samurai in terms of social utility, focusing on their occupation or work through a prism of comparison to farmers, artisans, and merchants. Quote, "The samurai is one who does not cultivate, does not manufacture, and does not engage in trade, but it cannot be that he has no function at all as a samurai. He who satisfies his needs without performing any function at all would probably be called an idler. He who lives his whole life without working should be called a rebel against heaven. Hence we ask ourselves, how can it be that the samurai has no occupation? And it is only when we ask about the function of the samurai that his calling becomes apparent." End quote. That social utility, given the lack of military action, was then defined primarily in terms of moral leadership and edification. Quote, "The scholarly way constitutes his heart, but externally he keeps the tools of a warrior to hand. The three classes of the common people automatically take him as their teacher and look up to him. By following his teachings, they come to know the original nature," this Neo-Confucian term, original nature. "This is how the way of the samurai arises." Samurai were thus transformed, at least in Yamaga's ideal, in fact only in Yamaga's ideal, into Confucian teachers, leading the commoners to personal enlightenment through the recovery of the original nature, the shared single principle of Neo-Confucianism. The samurai was to become a kind of Neo-Confucian missionary, exemplifying and teaching a salvational ideal to the common people. Here we see the quintessential practical reasoning of the early modern samurai, but deployed to argue for a Confucian ethical ethos of service. Not only was violence relativized as only one part of samurai identity, but the other part was rooted firmly in benevolence and righteousness, Confucian virtues that called not only for loyalty and probity of service to superiors, but also for love of the common people. Crucially, identity was justified primarily in terms of this service to the interests of the commoners. Other influential samurai Confucians around this time, including some with real political power, were advancing similar arguments. And Kumazawa Banzan, who was pretty much the Prime Minister of Bizen Okayama-han, is a good example, who was actually removed from office because his ideas were getting a little bit too progressive in this sense. So this honing of samurai, and this is all early mid-1600s. The honing of samurai identity, although on the one hand strengthening and justifying samurai status within a hierarchicalized caste system, also redefined it in interaction with universalist principles which included and even prioritized the welfare of the people. Samurai themselves, thereby, increasingly identified through a cultural as much as military role. And this was particularly the case seeing there were no wars anymore. When employed, if they were employed, they were more likely using a brush than a sword. But the strong population growth of 17th century Japan, including among the samurai, meant that most samurai were not employed. They were not required for government service. And this is an interesting parallel, of course, with late Ming and Qing China, where there were so many people that there weren't enough government positions, right? So this is a similar situation. Most samurai, therefore, enjoyed a kind of otium, this Latin term for this useful and cultured leisure, allowing them significant time to spend on what various historians of early modern Japan have called leisure learning, aesthetic networks, a library of public knowledge. And I think it was Watanabe Hiroshi who referred to a republic of letters as well. This trend was facilitated by the fact that from the 17th century onwards, samurai were restricted by law to residence in the larger towns and cities. So there was this so-called alternate attendant Sankin Kotai system of the Tokugawa shogunate, which required all the feudal houses to maintain significant samurai retinues in Edo. This meant that samurai were particularly concentrated in cities, and particularly in Edo, Tokyo, with significant concentrations in other big cities like Osaka and Kyoto. This urban base of samurai meant that almost all samurai lived very closely with other samurai and urban commoners in large cities. Due to the wealth of the large cities, many merchant households in particular, but also larger landholding peasants, despite being commoners, accrued wealth which in turn allowed a significant number of them to also enjoy surplus labour time. This surplus labour time was sometimes utilised to increase productivity, to maximise further wealth, as has been noted by economic historians like Hayami Akira. But it was also used for leisure, bringing an emerging burgher class of materially comfortable commoners into the same salon society networks frequented by many samurai. This created a situation where from the late 17th century onwards, urban Japanese, including both samurai and commoners, participated in civil society networks of leisure learning and aesthetics together. This trend, which broadened and deepened through the course of the Tokugawa period, increasingly created a web of social links permeating beyond the caste system of warrior versus commoner, which had held sway in the earlier years of the shogunate. The practice of leisure learning or aesthetic networks in early modern Japan was particularly interesting in the way it encouraged a diversification of interest, skills and networks, and sometimes a bifurcation of the nature of status, caste status and occupational skill. As Eiko Ikegami has explained, leisure learning, quote, supplied individual citizens with occasions for exchanging their feudal identities for identities otherwise defined, end quote. Now, Confucianism held a particularly privileged place within the field of all these different kinds of schools and learning groups because it was the base of book learning. The key role of Confucian schools in the overall function of the learning environment, and particularly the fields that used literary tools, explains the increasing permeation of Confucian ideas, ways of thinking and references into all aspects of cultural life in Japan through the late 17th century. Most people, in fact all people active in cultural production had received a good degree of Confucian schooling. A side effect, and these are all in private Confucian schools, right? These are all private, none of this is state provided, these are all private Confucian schools. A side effect of this deep and broad permeation of Confucian thought was the exposure of nearly the entire population to Confucian ideals of governance and Confucian debates on what we would today call political philosophy or political theory. This innately political discourse thus became by default a base knowledge level of knowledge within a booming salon society comprised of very large numbers of samurai, and which also in urban centres in particular linked samurai who were not employed in the government to an increasingly sprawling governing apparatus populated by the minority of samurai who were employed, and also linked them in with significant segments of the commoner population. So I'd then like to move on to section 2, the sort of intellectual content of what was happening in this salon society. What you could call, in a way, this idea of political economy, which you could maybe, I wouldn't, but you could even call an ideology of democracy to some degree. Most of the writing and discussion in these Confucian parts of salon society revolved around this Confucian paradigm of political economy. This word, of course, there is a word in Japanese and in Chinese, of course, now, keizai, jinji, means economy, but back then it related to the longer phrase, right, to the idea of ordering the world and saving or succouring the people. In early modern times, the term thus usually retained these welfare connotations associated with the full phrase's exaltation to succour the people. From the latter 17th century onwards, this idea of governance and the relatively wide role of governance contained therein came to replace more pre-modern concepts of government, which had focused upon simply supervising agriculture and controlling water. The more expansive Confucian-influenced ideal of ordering the world and succouring the people, or political economy, thereby also facilitated discussions of governance in much broader terms, as the concept itself assumed consideration of government's role in securing the livelihoods of ordinary people. Political economy became the new operative term for describing the role of the state and a baseline for discussion in politics. One powerful example of an issue debated in terms of political economy during the Tokugawa period was the relationship between taxation, samurai stipends, salaries, the financial system, and the rice base of the economy. Very modern kind of argument, really, taxes and public sector salary. A key function of the shogunal and domainal governments in the Japan of this period was the payment of salaries to samurai. If you think about it, this government began with demilitarization. The government began in a state of total war and dealt with having too many soldiers, dealt with that situation by putting them into the cities, regulating them, right? And part of that regulation entailed having to pay them salaries all the time. Now, these samurai stipends were traditionally paid as a stipend of rice, paid as rice, in rice. But the predominantly urban samurai population spent most of their salaries on things other than rice. And this created a lucrative conversion business run by members of the merchant caste who converted rice salaries into money, into cash. The necessary insertion of merchant caste middlemen into this system came to be seen as inviting corruption and price manipulation, particularly price manipulation of rice. The monetization of the staple food grain inherent in the system thereby linked what originally would have been a question of elite salary and taxation to the very popular issue of food. Food, and when there is a famine, famine. The ongoing dysfunction in the market for rice, which was still the staple food for most people across most of Japan, came to be blamed on this system, elevating its debate to the popular level. One of the most famous treatises critiquing this was one of the most famous political texts of the Tokugawa period, which is Ogyusurai's Seidan that you see here. Originally presented as a blueprint for the wholesale restructure and renewal of Japan's feudal order under the Tokugawas, it traced the Tokugawa Japan's economic woes. Ogyusurai is also, Japan's most famous Confucian scholar, right? So he's the most famous Confucian scholar in Japanese history, and this is his most famous political text. And he traces in this text Japan's economic woes, particularly the problems of the peasantry, to the dysfunction of the rice market, triggered by the monetarization of the salary system. So Sarai proposed the radical step of reversing the laws which kept samurai in the cities and stopping daimyo, feudal lords, from having to keep the retinues in Edo. He argued that samurai should instead be returned to the land, and that daimyo as well as samurai should then not only physically but economically be based in their own estates, ending their current habit of living as if at an inn, as Sarai repeatedly put it. The solution was total reformulation of the shogunal system, putting samurai back on the land and thereby ending both samurai urbanization and the strict physical separation from the peasantry which had necessitated the rice salary system. The welfare-oriented nature of the proposals in this same work included recommendations for the establishment of communal, quote, communal rice storehouses as they have in China, end quote, to assist the peasantry in times of famine. Sarai's analysis was also noteworthy in that the interests his reforms purported to protect, those of the peasantry and the samurai, were overtly contrasted against the interests of the merchant. Quote, and this is the highlight area here, is, quote, it is a question of who is to be dominant and lord, and who subordinate and servant. At present, the merchants are in the dominant position, and the buke, the samurai houses, are subordinate, since the buke, the samurai, living as they are, an inn-like life, living in hotels basically, cannot do without money and must sell their rice in exchange for money to buy their daily necessities. It is for this reason that the merchants are dominant and the samurai subordinate. As a result, the merchants can set the prices as they wish. If the samurai lived on their estates, they could live without selling their rice, while the merchants would have to buy it, and thus the samurai would be dominant and the merchants subordinate. In such a case, the samurai would be able to set prices at their pleasure. This is an eternal and universal law whose origins lie in the vast and profound wisdom of the sages. As we shall see below, these kinds of political analysis, despite coming from erudite Confucian scholars, enjoyed a considerable popular following and even became wrapped up in the nature of popular protest during this period. Popular protest meaning revolts and riots. Furthermore, in addition to this targeted critique of particular policy directions, the establishment of a general ideal of civil, welfare-oriented governance also led sections of elite society to offer strident critique of the entire system of shogunal governance in more vitriolic forms. For instance, Kogaseri later appointed one of the so-called three professors of the shogunal state Confucian Academy in the late 1700s. In this memorial, written to his domain lord several years prior to his appointment into the shogunate, had attacked the entire hereditary basis of state appointment. As our country is under a regime of generals, the path of election is closed. Particularly in domains such as ours, the damage of the hereditary system is not to be avoided. Those with hereditary status are negligent, and those without do not serve. This is why the spirit of the shi, the gentleman or samurai, cannot be enacted, and why custom can so degenerate. Koga, the writer here, is directly attacking the feudalism praised by Fukuzawa and Suda. In his widely circulated memorial Ritsuzan Joso, likely written in the 1760s, another one of these three professors, and thereby one of the state's most senior scholars, Shibano Ritsuzan, noted ominously, quote, the prince is like a boat, the mass is like the water, quoting from Confucian texts here obviously. The water can support a boat well, but cannot overturn it. The masses can live well under the rule of a prince, or can destroy him. The winds and waves of the masses rise when the sentiments of the masses are obstructed. For this reason, since antiquity, making sure the sentiments of the masses are communicated has been the primary business of governance. And then he quoting from Zhengyi or Zhenghao, I don't know, one of the two Chengs, Chengyi or Chenghao, he quotes, communicating the sentiments of the masses means ensuring the sovereign is informed about the suffering of the masses. Now, the invocation of the warning from the classical Confucian text, Xunzi, was followed by Ritsuzan's advice on listening to the sentiments of the masses. This linked into Koga's emphasis on the traditional idea of remonstrance in another cutting attack on the nature of Japan's government and ruling class. In Japan particularly, the culture of remonstration is not performed. Lines of communication are normally closed, and the sentiments of the masses are not communicated up to those on high. This is because the path of education is not propagated. A sovereign who would leave behind the bad practices of former years and set right the state must first collect the knowledge of many people. To do this, there is nothing more urgent than opening the channels of communication. These powerful condemnations, not just of individual policies, but of the system of Tokugawa governance, were not made by outsiders, but by men, these Kogaseri and Shibano Ritsuzan, men promoted into the top of bureaucratic education in the Tokugawa state. Notably, their promotions occurred after they authored these incendiary texts. This shows a very different relationship between political critique and state action than many scholars have previously associated with a shogunate. The manner through which Shibano and Koga combined different Neo-Confucian ideas to seemingly attribute a role for the commoners, perhaps usually reserved for the gentry in more standard Confucian interpretations, is noteworthy. Shibano Ritsuzan and Kogaseri's conflation of traditional Neo-Confucian ideas of remonstrance, indications of the sentiments of the masses, and then Cheng Hao's idea of opening channels of communication, Kai and Lu, putting these three together, as they do, indicated a vision of the critical writings and views outside the state, Confucians outside the state, as representing the sentiments of the people. This is an interesting conflation of ideas on the roles of the gentry with the sentiments of the masses. It's noteworthy that this rather radical identification of gentry and commoners occurred in a political society where structurally most of the gentry were removed from political influence. They were just as much removed as commoners were. Ritsuzan, Seiri and other major political thinkers of this period clearly saw what modern historiography too readily labels elite political thought as closely intertwined not only with the welfare of the lower classes, but also with their opinions. This view reflected the reality of the way political opinions circulated in early modern Japan, with street rumour and action interacting with articulated written political opinion. And that brings us to the third and last part, political critique and political protest. This interaction between relatively elite political thinking and public sentiment intensified through the course of the 18th century in particular. Popular protest, large-scale riot and rebellion also provides examples of the way debate and discourse traverse different segments of the population. Between 1782 and 1888, just a couple of decades after the appearance and dissemination of the very last writings I showed you, at this time in the 1780s, famine devastated large sections of Japan. The consequent social and political upheaval from this famine began with the assassination of the Prime Minister Tanuma Okitsugu's son in 1784 and led to his own formal abdication of office at the end of 1786. But it peaked the following year in the summer of 1787 in the Edo Ujikowashi, the Edo riots. In this massive popular protest, the government lost control of Edo for several days, as they'd lost control of Osaka a few days earlier in a similar uprising. Now, one interesting aspect of these protests, and you see there's actually a graphic representation of it here, is that the protesters targeted the specialist merchants who converted samurai rice into cash. So that point, these people were called fudasashi. Fudasashi were these merchants who specialised in converting samurai rice salary into cash and who'd been attacked by sarai. The direct action of the protesters thus actually interacted with learned theoretical analysis from Confucian political economists like Ogyu Sarai, holding public debt and the rice taxation and salary system responsible for the famine. For those on the street, this link was personified by the particular merchants who transferred samurai rice salary into the currency form used for debt. Disciplined symbolism of the performative act of the protesters, rioters, carried out in the streets, often in front of fudasashi houses, made this clear. And this actually, what happened, so this is not looting, right? What happened, they didn't just attack these places and steal the rice. This history has been very, very well written by a lot of Japanese scholars, and also there's a American scholar called Anne Waldhall who's written a lot about this recently as well. And you can sort of see this happening here, where the things that were taken from the house would be ritualistically laid out in front of the house to make a protest. So a lot of historical sources suggest that the attacks on the Fudesashi were not looting and personal attacks. They were sort of, there was all this symbolism attached with this. Only in the days after these protests were samurai nobles able to force the resignation of the people that Tanuma had put in to represent him in the shogunate, and instead have Matsudaira Sadanobu appointed as senior councillor and a few months later as shogunal regent. So it's a regime change, right? What happens is a regime change. Matsudaira Sadanobu's new government recognised what was happening by differentiating itself as much as possible from the former government. The early policies of the Kansei reform government that Matsudaira Sadanobu led were overtly interventionist measures, such as the establishment of government-supported village grain stores holding 50% of local needs, exactly the proposal that Ogyusarai had made, which is of course taken from Han Dynasty precedents. And these were funded by a new tax on 50 koku on every 10,000 koku holding and above. Despite being introduced as emergency measures, these basically redistributive 1789 laws on grain provision, together with the village grain store policy, actually stayed in place until near the end of the Tokugawa period. The nature of the protests at the end of this Tenmei famine and the nature of government reform in the new Kansei government demonstrate interaction between elite samurai aristocratic, lower samurai private Confucian scholar, and plebeian street politics. As alluded to earlier, this broad sphere of political debate was supported by unusually high literacy. Elsewhere, I've used significant examples of popular graffiti to illustrate the broad social penetration and influence of Confucian political ideas in mid-Tokugawa Japan, particularly in urban settings like Edo, and specifically during this particular period of political upheaval. These include manuscript recordings of one particular incidence of political graffiti which parodies Cheng Yi's introduction to the Dashue and Jushi's commentary of the text to criticize the policies of the Tanuma government, to criticize Tanuma Okitsugu, the Prime Minister of Japan at the time. Despite the erudite content and necessarily high level of literacy necessary to understand this particular graffiti, this is a textual recording of the graffiti that was seen in many places in Japan at this time. Despite the erudite content, this graffiti is described in multiple, like nearly 100 descriptions of this particular graffiti, usually in places like canal walls. Right, the walls of canals, which, it's similar to here in Taipei, and if you've been to Tokyo, what I mean is you see these areas where people walk, actually just here, the river, right? These are public areas where people commute and so forth. So to put graffiti there is that's a very public space, a very popular space for graffiti to appear. And by the way, in terms of the global history of graffiti, that's very unusual. So most early modern graffiti in early modern Europe appears inside, for instance, hotels, on the inside buildings. Or if it's outside, for instance, there's many examples in Florence and Venice, then it appears in very small alleyways where you have to specially go there to see the political comment. But this is in public thoroughfares, right? So it's quite different. Graffiti was clearly linked to the literary landscape of aesthetic networks and libraries of public knowledge clustered around Confucian learning described earlier. A landscape which this example shows laid the basis for a vibrant political discourse. I don't have time to go, I don't want to take all the time going through this, but just because it's quite funny to show you how it works, right? In Japanese, of course, most of you would read this in Chinese, would read this text in Chinese, but you probably know there's a way to read these texts in Japanese, which is just shown here, right? So this would be, so in Chinese, in Japanese, you'd read that as shiteishi iwaku, daigaku koshi no kishi, right? And here it's shuten shi iwaku, daiaku toji no ishu. So you see, and the whole way through, it rhymes like this. So the text rhymes. It rhymes exactly, but the meaning, as you can see, daigaku, dashue, becomes the great evil. Yeah, and you can see, and it's quite humorous actually as it continues along. But it's wonderful. It's very, very well written because it rhymes the whole way. So what significance does this integrated field of politics have for our consideration of democracy? On the one hand, one could say, well, there's nothing unusual about peasant uprisings, you could say, right? But riots in pre-modern societies, in those historical contexts, were usually appeals for the attention of the elite, appeals for attention of lords and sometimes sovereigns. More modern or early modern protests are different. And again, we go to E.P. Thompson's work, this famous work by E.P. Thompson about protest, in that these kind of protests harness analysis of the socio-economic problems lying behind popular pain. They don't just demand attention from the elite, they advance policy solutions, or they advance complex analysis of the political problems, and they demand changes in the leadership. They demand changes of leadership, which of course here happened. So the Edo riot, I should call it Edo Koashi or Edo protest, whatever, notably in relation to the analysis that preceded it and the regime and policy changes that followed it, is clearly an example of this later pattern of protest. And this can be seen not only from the timing of the change in the leadership and in the shogunate's policy presentation thereafter, but also in the intimate connections between popular and elite public discourse and action leading up to the transition. So to try and sort of move towards the conclusion, and this is where I'm having trouble, so how does this history resonate with the modern narratives put forward by Fukuzawa and examined earlier in the chapter? And what might this history tell us about either modern constructions of democracy or indeed the nature of democracy itself? Ironically, it was after non-warrior caste challenges to samurai rule were comprehensively eradicated at the end of the 1500s, and after an unchallenged national shogunate government fully stabilised in the 1600s, only then did the militarist nature of that regime come to be significantly challenged and decline. Militarist and hereditary samurai government was challenged from within by the samurai from which it was constituted. This was due to significant change, or one could even say evolution, in the military nature of governance, and indeed in the social relations, activities and ideologies of the samurai themselves during Japan's early modern development from the 1600s onwards. Politics, notably including samurai participation in the political sphere, became more complex, less based on military principles alone, and more inclusive of non-warrior caste actors during the period of Tokugawa rule. One explanation for this, common among current Japanese scholars of the history of political thought, like Watanabe Hiroshi, is that more democratic, politically, he wouldn't use the word democratic, but that more politically critical thinking emerged in Japan under shogunal rule, partly in relation or in reaction to shogunal structures themselves. Early modern critique of the shogunal and domainal governments, as we have seen, was usually couched in Neo-Confucian political terms, using developed Neo-Confucian political theory coming from Imperial China, which defined itself as against feudalism. The popularization of Confucian political theory in Japan, particularly from the later 17th century, during the most developed stages of shogunal rule, has thus been attributed to Neo-Confucian thought's particular incompatibility to the political structures of Tokugawa Japan, exactly because it doesn't fit with the structures. That's why it works. According to this analysis, it was exactly the tension between the Confucian political thought on the one hand and the hereditary shogunal structural reality on the other that provided Confucianism its critical edge and social magnetism, in turn enabling a creative schism to emerge between political ideas and reality. Unlike the schism Fukuzawa had imagined between religious and brute power, This was a schism between political reality and political ideals, one which opened out the potential for engagement with ideas of political change. Most current historians of the political thought of this period in Japan, Watanabe Hiroshi, Mitani Hiroshi, Matsuda Koichiro, Maeda Tomu, Kurozumi Makoto, alongside Japanese historians of China like Murata Yujiro, see Confucianism as sowing the intellectual seeds of the kinds of political thinking and reforms that led to the Meiji Restoration and later constitutional government. Some go so far as to call the Meiji Restoration a Confucian revolution, which Watanabe Hiroshi does. But this schism also chimes with global historical methods and theories of the early modern. For instance, Koselleck's idea of the horizon of expectation, which is the idea that as society transforms, and particularly as surplus labour emerges, and you get this larger middling group emerges, which happens as part of early modern development, that this horizon of expectation emerges among the general population that things will improve and that they should be able to have some part in that. To sum up the differences between the history we've talked about today and the ideas established by Fukuzawa, firstly, although it's true that democratic ideas and practices emerged under shogunate rule, they emerged only in the last shogunate, the Tokugawa, and only after its stabilisation. Secondly, it appears not to have been the militaristic ethos of horizontal self-solidarity of samurai bands, the non-Chinese element according to Tsuda, that inspired these practices. Rather, the growing practice of samurai identifying themselves as literati and adopting identities influenced by Confucian-inspired continental conceptions of the gentry was a major vehicle for the emergence of these ideas and practices. Thirdly, the social context which facilitated what was again defined primarily not by the militarism of the Tokugawa period, but by the increasingly horizontally networked and socially integrated nature of urban society in early modernity. Fourthly and crucially, this broadly horizontally networked urban society reached a critical mass. Literally, the literate middling population's size was large enough that it reached into the ordinary lives and practices of the masses, represented through mass protest action and popular graffiti, interacting directly with political theory critique and later changing government policy. In other words, it was the peace and productivity, the urbanisation and literacy, more than the militarism and hierarchy, which facilitated this change. Getting back to, so I have a few more summarising comments that I could make. I'm just looking at the time, because when I timed myself, I only spoke for 1 hour and 15 minutes, but I see that we've only got 20 minutes left, so I might try and wrap up a bit early. Just one or two last things I might say. I'll just jump to a couple of points I've got at the end of this conclusion. One topic that people often engage in theories of democracy, and we'll talk about this more tomorrow, is many theorists continue to see democracy as something that emerges from a particular cultural setting or is associated with a particular culture, liberal, Christian, Confucian, British, whatever. And in the Tokugawa example, we see that some people claim this in terms of Japanese cultural authenticity, and that the contra-argument I give today, showing Confucian influence, some people could misunderstand this, that I'm saying, well, the origins of this kind of democratic thinking in Tokugawa Japan were Neo-Confucian. Oh, so it wasn't quintessential Japanese thinking, it was the Chinese thinking that made them democratic. But this is not my point. My point is that in confrontation with the Tokugawa state, Neo-Confucian ideas triggered a more inclusive way of thinking in a context of early modern urbanisation and development. Importantly, Japanese figures of the Tokugawa, their use of Neo-Confucian ideas went beyond their original meaning in, for instance, a Chinese imperial context. And this example of Kaiyen Lu, and what that actually meant, we discussed briefly. So thought is only one part. Only once it is politically and socially manifested can we see its democratic form. And I guess that's the takeaway in terms of historical method for me in looking at this issue. There's a lot more in the conclusion, but I think I'll wrap it up so that there's some time for discussion, and I'll end it there. Thank you.
Fascinating talk, and so you, by laying out these main arguments from your chapter in the Cambridge History of Democracy, which is not out yet, I suppose you are still writing it. So you gave us really a masterclass in Japanese intellectual history. So it was really, all these details were really lovely. And particularly loved the graffiti, the context to the Chinese Neo-Confucian classics of the Daxue as a great learning. So and then I think there will be much to talk about. And I think what you said at the end, that you reminded us of both of the importance of political ideas, particular Neo-Confucian ideas, but you also reminded us that we need to understand ideas in social context. So because there are many scholars now who, I think, promote a kind of a culturalistic account of Neo-Confucianism and of traditional Confucian ideas, which I think you're rightly critical of. Yeah. So these contexts, the link between ideas and social and political settings, this came out very clearly, and thank you again. And I think we have 15 minutes, about 15 minutes or 20 minutes if we want to pass over the time. So I think there will be questions in the audience or comments. Please go ahead, raise your hand, and we have also people in the audience, online audience, so you can if you happen to be online, then you can also, of course, make your first question for you.
Okay, thank you. I'm Mei Jung Wei from Graduate Institute of Development Studies at NCCU, and it is a great pleasure to listen to your lecture. I'm not sure whether this questions or comments, but anyway, I'll just go with my thoughts. Okay, you mentioned both Confucianism is democracy as well as Confucianism can be democracy. I think if we are being a little bit picky, but I personally think the distinction between these two statements actually could be quite crucial, especially when we think about whether democracy is culturally specific and what would be the kind of implication for the nature of democracy, as you briefly touched upon, but you did not really get into the details about this issue, and you say that would be the topic for tomorrow, but unfortunately I will not be able to attend tomorrow's workshop. But anyway, what do you think about kind of Confucianism can be democracy and Confucianism is democracy, as well as the cultural particularity of democracy based upon your discussion about the Japanese trajectory and the history? Thank you.
Or shall we collect a few more questions? Okay, then maybe we collect a few more questions and comments. Yeah, and please raise your hand if you want to say anything. Yep, please.
Thank you for providing a lot of information about the modern history, early modern history of Japan. I try to use my words to summarize your talk. That is, the social change plus the provision of Neo-Confucian discourses produce the development of democracy in a way. So if that summary is not too wrong, my question is, in this case, Neo-Confucian discourses obviously is utilized or used as a means, as a handy intellectual discourse for those people who want to advance their needs. So there are new needs produced by the social development, urbanization, a lot of things you describe. And these new needs, to advance these new needs, they use both protest and Neo-Confucius discourse to advance their needs. If that is the case, what do you think are these new needs?
Maybe one more question or one more comment, and then we can ask Professor Paramore to respond. Yeah. Is there anybody in the online audience, maybe online, who wants to ask a question? No? Okay. Then please go ahead. Yeah.
Yes. Thank you very much for those questions. Let me answer the second questions first because it's in my head, and then I will come back to it. Thank you, Professor Zhang, for these questions. Again, very useful. And I should warn everybody asking questions that I haven't written the conclusion to this chapter yet, so your ideas might end up in the conclusion. Yeah, so firstly, in terms of the first point you made, Professor Zhang, about social change plus provision of Neo-Confucian discourse, that this these producing this sort of more democratic or whatever way of thinking. I would say not just Neo-Confucian discourse, and I didn't have time to talk about this here, but in my book about Japanese Confucianism I write quite a lot about this. It's also Neo-Confucian practice, and the kind of practice that emerges in Confucian interactions, from the Song dynasty onwards. So, for instance, this sort of practice of debate, practice of textual analysis. Even yesterday's conversation. Remember we were talking about Mick Hunter's idea that right from the beginning of the tradition you have multiple commentaries. So even in the Han Dynasty, you've got multiple commentaries. So you always have to sit together and discuss what is the meaning, which meaning is there, and of course once you enter into early modernity in the Chinese imperial context, whether that's the Southern Song or the Ming, it doesn't really matter. You do have lots of these discussion groups and so forth, also in urban settings in Suzhou and other places all through East Asia. So this practice, this form of practice, this sort of form of debate was very powerful in Tokugawa Japan, because technically Tokugawa Japan was supposed to be a caste segregated society, and yet this created space where people could interact and talk about these things. So it wasn't just the discourse. The discourse, as we showed, had important aspects, like a lot of Zhengyi and Zheng Hao's ideas of communication, which of course draw on earlier sources of communicating shashing, the kajo in Japanese, the sentiments upwards and so forth. These discourse is part of it as well, but also practice. So that's the first thing I'd say. And then, so it's not just the discourse, it's forms of practice which have emerged through history in different parts of history. And then this interesting thing, is this to address their new needs, and what are their new needs? And I think, is it about, so firstly I'd question that, is it just new needs, or is it a new mentality that thinks their needs should be addressed? And we've seen this I guess Professor Zhang, you and I are about the same age, so we would have seen this in our own lives. We see that our students expect certain things that we did not expect, right? They have certain expectations that we would have never had, right? So expectations change, and this is Koselleck's idea, is that in early modern society, people's expectation, begin to have this horizon of expectation, and it changes. So it's not just about new needs, it's also about new expectations. And then the state, though, does have new needs, and the state has new complex administrative and financial needs, complex needs of financial administration. So the state has new needs, the people have at least new expectations. And I think, though you were saying they advance these needs through both Neo-Confucian discourse and protest, yes, and these things interact with each other. So then, and then feel free to come back if I haven't answered that correctly, and I'll just, sorry, what was it? I didn't catch your name, I'm sorry. Professor. So is democracy culturally specific? Well, this is the question, isn't it? This is really the big question, because many people in our society, in the world today, do think democracy is culturally specific, and there's no doubt about that. Right? And so I'm amazed how prevalent in the West, whatever the West is, I'm amazed how prevalent this idea still is, that democracy is this thing passed on like a virus, that originated in Athens, and then this disease that gets caught and moved on, or this football, like passing a football along. It's amazing how many quite advanced thinkers even seem to think in this way still. So that's a sort of way of thinking which sees ideas, including democracy, as having sort of cultural roots and moving, rather than an idea I spoke about in the previous talks, a conjunctural idea, for instance, where similar ideas arise in the same place. Now, obviously, my approach, this historical approach, you see I'm using these historical theories like Koselleck's theory, that see things arising because of the nature of society, and those things that happen in society happen in different societies at different times. All societies urbanize at some stage, right? So things like this will trigger certain events. Is democracy culturally specific? It can't be, because if it is, culture is in continual change. if democracy is culturally specific, you know how certain Anglo-Saxons, certain English speakers will say, oh, well, democracy is all comes from our great English-speaking culture and British liberalism and Parliament and all this sort of stuff, and it's all from the late 19th century, and we just have to get back to the late 19th century, and then we'll recover, then democracy and liberalism will work properly, and people say this. But you can't get back to the late 19th century. Culture continuously changes. So any definition that tries to root democracy in any culture is doomed to failure because culture is in continual change. So even if you imagine that only England and America and Australia, that was the whole world, and there was no other world, even then the idea of trying to try and see democracy as culturally specific would destroy any potential for democracy, because there's no way you can take Australia and Britain and America and put them back in John Stuart Mill's time, right? You can't do that. So therefore, and I think this is what's informing ideas like I mentioned that particular journal, Democratic Theory, and various thinkers who are thinking about this. I think this is what informs their thinking, because they're living in multicultural societies, in rapidly transitioning multicultural societies, and they're just saying, well, we have to be, and many of them are Democrats. They believe in democracy, you know. So then they're desperate to then try and create a theories of democracy that somehow are not culturally specific. I think because they themselves are Democrats, and they realise that democracy is totally unsustainable in any sort of system which sees it as culturally specific because of the nature of our world, right? I think, yeah.
Thank you. Any more comments or remarks? So maybe I can smuggle in one small remark, because I was very intrigued. I'm still intrigued by by what you said about these iko-iki, you know, these Buddhist states. So I'm not really familiar with this part of Japanese history, but this is intriguing to me. So because you didn't say much about Buddhism there, you know, in your narrative, and so equality became very important, no, in Mahayana Buddhism, and there is this idea in Chinese history, not somehow that the value of equality was rediscovered or first created by Buddhist scholars, and Mencius even became so prominent only because of Buddhist influence in the Song dynasty. So, and I remember that because you mentioned what was his name again? This Banzan, no? Yeah. So he was a Yomei Gaku scholar, no? Yang Ming. So and I think Yomei Gaku was introduced into Japan by Chan scholars, Chan monks. So and Yomei Gaku was often conceived to be somehow closer even than Shushi Gaku to Buddhism. So there seems to be another schism there, no, between Yomei Gaku and Shushi Gaku, and Shushi Gaku was more kind of closer with the government, no, and Yomei Gaku was closer to the people somehow. That's my very superficial understanding. So maybe you can say more about this. Yeah.
Well, firstly, thank you for the first comment. I actually hadn't thought about that, and it's a very good point. So I'm going to have to take that away and think about that, the role of Buddhist influence there. I'm going to have to think about that. That's a very good point. In terms of the second point, this is often a traditional way of thinking that in the Tokugawa shogunate, was more closer to Jutsushui. They were more closer to Jushi thinking, and that Wang Yangming thinking was outside the shogunate and was more critical, and that Jushi thinking was less critical and was close to the shogunate. Current historiography, we consider this not the case anymore, and I'll give you a good example. The really incendiary quotes I gave, those scholars who are really saying, you know, it's hereditary, you don't have remonstrance, you're a regime of generals, you know, those guys who were really viciously attacking the shogunate, they were the most prominent Jushi-aligned thinkers. And Matsudaira Sadanobu, the leader we talked about, he appointed them to run the shogunal Confucian Academy, and he issued a public order. It's in the book actually, my book. He issued a public order which he let everybody see, telling all the other scholars that they have to follow these guys in the government, the other government scholars. And so, because there was this family, the Hayashi family, who had hereditary control of the Confucian family, and basically Matsudaira Sadanobu publicly humiliated them by releasing this thing saying, yeah, you can still be the hereditary head, but please, any decisions you hand to these guys, which are these same very, very critical but Jushi-aligned scholars. And you saw the way they love to use the Chung brothers. The Chung brothers are the main people they use in their arguments.
Thank you.
Yep, thank you.
We have, I think, 5 more minutes, so maybe there's time for a final round of questions, comments. Yeah, please.
Okay, if I remember correctly, when you talk about the definition of democracy, you only mention rule of the people and by the people, rather than including for the people, right? And yet, in the case of Japan or early modern Japan, the focus, as I understand your lecture, actually is on the so-called welfare-oriented governance of the shogunate, right? And if we kind of emphasize the dimension of welfare, then we probably would emphasize the other element of our understanding of democracy, which is for the people. And when we talk about the relationship or relevance of neo-Confucianism or Confucianism to the modern conception of democracy, we normally, as I understand it again, would focus on the aspect of for the people rather than rule by the people and of the people. And that is where all the kind of critical examination of whether, say, Neo-Confucianism or Confucianism is a genuine kind of conception of democracy. So I would like to hear how you comment on this. Thank you.
Thank you very much. It's funny, for tomorrow's session, I've been quickly reading as much sort of democratic theory as I can, especially people who talk about Confucianism and democratic theory. Sung-Moon Kim is a very big scholar in this at the moment, right? And I find it really amazing that a lot of them, they when they define democracy, they talk about popular sovereignty. So, and the idea of, by the people, not just for the people. My idea is very much, for the people, right? But it's amazing how even most of these, quite a lot of these democratic theorists in general, and also the ones talking about Confucianism, they see popular sovereignty as an absolutely essential part of democracy. But most Western democratic countries are not popularly sovereign. I'm a citizen of 2 countries, both of which are constitutional monarchies, Australia and the Netherlands, right? Japan is the most long-lasting democracy in East Asia. I mean, actually, in the post-war constitution, they have popular sovereignty because the Americans asked them to put that in, right? But in the pre-war Japanese democracy, right, no, there's no popular sovereignty, right? Sovereignty rests with the emperor, right? So I find it amazing that theorists talk about popular sovereignty as if it's a core to democracy, when the majority of European countries are really not based on the idea of popular sovereignty. Right? Yeah. So I'm very much happy with for the people. Yeah, I guess. Yeah.
So maybe one final question, or shall we just stop here? So I think we are almost out of time. So thanks again, Professor Paramore. This was a wonderful talk, and I'm looking forward to your workshop tomorrow. And I hope that many of you here will also join Professor Paramore tomorrow for the workshop. Thanks again, and see you tomorrow.